Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
The trade war with the U.S. rages on, with counter tariffs announced by Canada this week in retaliation for U.S. tariffs put in place last week. All of this has upended a trading relationship between Canada and the U.S. that's existed for decades, and it has the potential to do damage to some of our small businesses, which are already struggling to survive. I'm Kris McCusker, and in this episode of In This Economy, we speak to Brad Poulus, lecturer in the Entrepreneurship Department at Toronto Metropolitan University at the Ted Rogers School of Management. Appreciate you taking the time today.
Sure.
I'm just looking at some stats here. 98% of all employer businesses in Canada are small business. This is a big deal for the Canadian economy.
For sure. Yeah, small business is one of the key drivers of the Canadian economy. There's no question about it. So the 98% captures the number of businesses. And of course, the 2% that don't fall in that category, some of them have thousands and thousands of employees. So the number of actual people that are employed by small businesses is much lower, closer to around 2/3.
Okay, fair enough. But safe to say, these tariffs are going to impact a wide majority of Canadian businesses.
Let's focus our discussion on small businesses. Only around 20% of small businesses actually export to the United States. So think about it. Your average dry cleaner and convenience store, they fall in that category and they're not exporting anything. So we're talking about around 20% of small businesses. If we brought large and medium-sized businesses into it, of course, it would be a much larger percentage. So I'm not arguing that the effect on the Canadian economy is only hitting 20% of businesses, but if we focus on small business, it's around 20%. And around half of those are affected by the tariffs, because the tariffs don't hit everything. But for some of them, it's absolutely, a massive hit. It's in some cases, probably around 15% or so of the companies that are affected at all are going to be affected to the tune of around half of the revenue. So that's game changing. That's layoffs. That's potentially going out of business for a lot of businesses. So this is absolutely a huge deal for Canadians, no question about it.
And we've seen sort of some interesting, I think, reaction from some of the, advocates, we could say, for the small business, like the CFIB, saying that there have been some positives as part of this tariff relief program that the federal government released along with these counter tariffs, and that there are concerns from the CFIB about some of the relief programs and some of the, parameters for applying for those. So, there's a lot of advocation for small businesses out there, but I guess one worries about where we go from here. I guess my question is, is it going to be enough based on what you've heard so far?
Well, I guess we'd have to define what enough is, right? Like enough to do what? I'm certainly on board with what the CFIB is saying in terms of several of the comments that I've heard them make. So one is that the programs, the criteria are too restrictive and shut out a lot of small businesses because they have revenue requirements of $1 and in other cases $2 million, and I think even in one case $10 million of revenue. So that's obviously an issue. And then the complexity of the systems involved in implementing these various different programs. Quite often we're talking about having to deal with a government department that the small business doesn't already have a relationship with. We all have a relationship with CRA, for example. So a lot of people, and myself included, feel that CRA should be the primary mechanism, the primary, kind of channel through which any relief is provided. And that's currently, not the case. The other thing is that a lot of it is positioned as loans. And, a loan is just, all you're really doing is deferring the problem, so I think there's other ways that the government could be helping. And specifically, tax relief. So lowering the tax rate on the small business tax rate. I'm not, your listeners probably are aware, but there's two different tax rates in Canada in each province, actually, because they vary by province. But each province has a different rate for taxing profits above and below. Typically, the threshold is $500,000. So that would be, that'd be another thing they could do, reducing the fuel excise tax, perhaps even getting rid of the industrial carbon tax, at least for some period of time. All of those things would also directly help small business and would be less onerous from the point of view of the the application process and all of that. Would also be direct relief as opposed to having to apply for things. So
just want to pause here a little bit because, the Ontario Chamber of Commerce said something similar, right? Like they want to see simple, they want to see easy, straightforward plans that are going to, help businesses, which the chamber describes as being under extraordinary pressure.
yeah, I totally agree with that for sure. And a lot of the federal help as well is actually coming through the EI program, which is fine. I mean, so if people are losing their jobs as a result of this, then we absolutely need to deal with that. But about half of the money is coming through that way. So it's not direct relief for small businesses themselves, which are affected, as are their workers.
We've sort of been down this road lately, right? We've dealt with other tariffs. There have been other support programs, and we had COVID support programs. Like, it sort of strikes me as a little bit strange that we haven't kind of worked out some of the kinks and figured out how to easily get help to businesses at this point, given the last 6 years.
I agree. So I agree wholeheartedly. Um, we should be much better at this by now. Absolutely. No question about it. I think there's some lessons to be learned here too. So one is that, in the business school, especially I teach entrepreneurship, right? We talk about in small business, we talk about the dangers of customer concentration. So, I had a business once. This'll date me for sure, but Nortel was my biggest customer. So
Okay.
they've been gone for 20 years. So that there you guys can do the math. So Nortel was my biggest customer at around 30% of our revenue. And we were growing like crazy because it was the internet boom and of course the internet pulled telecom along with it. And I was in the business of selling products to the carriers in Canada, but also to the manufacturers of telecom gear, which we had lots of back then. And as hard as I tried to get our revenues down below 30% for revenue, everything kept growing along with Nortel, and it was always a big concern for me. So, and we Canadians, if we think about the Americans as a customer, right, we have massive customer concentration. We've been relying on the United States as our number one trading partner for a long time, and we've obviously benefited hugely from that. There's no question about that. But it doesn't come without risk. And we're now seeing when you have a pernicious, sometimes even irrational partner on the other side of the border, what the effect can be. So we obviously need to work with the Americans and try to get a better deal than what we have now, and perhaps that requires nothing more than waiting out the next 2 years until there's a change, maybe not in government, but at least in the human being that's at the top of it. But at the same time, we should also be doing the other things that Prime Minister Carney is doing, which is trying to diversify our economy and increase the amount of trade that we do with other countries.
Yeah, you make a really interesting point. And people with portfolios don't put all their money in company X. Is it harder for Canadian small business to maybe look to other markets than, is it an easier said than done situation?
Yes, absolutely. We have the convenience of first of all, it's a land border, so it's easy to get across. In a few cases there's rivers, but generally speaking, it's a relatively easy border to cross. They're the most proximate. They're the closest to us. And it's the number one consumer market in the world. So we're pretty lucky to be sitting beside it. So I'm not trying to diminish by any means the difficulty that it would entail. But just because something's hard doesn't mean that you don't do it. And I think we have to do it. And so part of the government's job, I think, is to make it not just the big businesses, but for small business as well, to make it easier. And there's lots of things there's programs that they have today that they could increase. So there's things like through the I'm not sure what we're calling the department now, but the department that looks after trade. And this is one I took I took advantage of some time ago, and I believe it's still in place. It's called PEMD, and it's the Program for Export Market Development. And so they provide money for things like trade missions and that sort of thing. And I went on a couple, one to Asia and one to South America back when. So there's absolutely things that they can do to help small business as well. I think sometimes the focus is too much on the larger businesses, and to the detriment, of course, of small biz.
Have any of the trade deals that Prime Minister Carney has struck outside of the U.S. Potentially opened the door for small business?
Well, sure, but they have to have access. So it's not easy for a small business in, I don't know, Manitoba to get access to potential customers in I don't know, the Czech Republic. So yeah, it's opened the door for sure, but but there's a lot more I think the government needs to do to make it so people can walk through that door.
Okay, that's fair. There is also an investment summit that is taking place in Toronto next month. Does that do anything to help small business? Like, I guess I'm just sort of wondering if part of what the government has been doing to drum up deals with other markets, if small and medium-sized businesses can sort of piggyback on those agreements.
These are ships that turn very slowly, right? They're big. It's difficult to do a lot of these things quickly. There's no question about it. And quite frankly, the small business community, investment isn't its biggest issue. In fact, one of the big issues is the investments that they're not going to make. So, the biggest outcome, I think, from all of this over the last couple of years is actually the uncertainty. It's the fact that you can no longer count on things. For several years, we had NAFTA, and then we had the, it's children, I guess we'll call it, the deals the trade deals that came after NAFTA. And we had relative certainty for a long time, and that gives businesses both large and small the comfort that they need to make investment. Small businesses now are pulling back hugely on investment, and that's going to have a second order impact, of course. So when a small manufacturer with 50 employees, when they delay, updating their production line, there's some company in Canada that would have had that business of updating that production line. And that business isn't happening now. So there's second order impacts here, as well as the direct impact of US tariffs on Canadian exports to the United States, but even also on the counter tariffs. So let's understand, the counter tariffs are a tax on Canadians. We got to call a spade here. So that's what it is. The counter tariffs are taxes. You can call it a tariff, but it's just a tax that Canadian firms now have to pay when they import goods from the United States. Now, I understand the logic of the Prime Minister and his team of doing it. The idea is, one, to retaliate. We have to do something. We can't just take it. I get that. But the other thing is what we're trying to do, and I agree with this part. If we're going to put counter tariffs, then I agree with the approach being taken, which is that we're targeting goods that have Canadian alternatives. So where it might have been more economical for you to import, good A from Ohio, by tariffing it, we've now made some company in Laval, Quebec more competitive. And so, if you're going to put tariffs on, I think that is the right way to do it. But we have to understand that at the end of the day, we're increasing costs for Canadian businesses and ultimately then probably Canadian consumers. The other thing to understand is, as I mentioned at the hop, 20% of Canadian small businesses export to the United States. 50% of Canadian small businesses import. So the counter tariffs actually have a greater impact. Sorry, like a wider impact. I shouldn't say greater, but a wider impact than the tariffs being levied by the United States.
And I mean, as I mentioned, this is bare bones. It has the potential to raise costs at a time when that's already a factor. Like things are already more expensive than they were before COVID. So this is, another hit to businesses that have been struggling to survive pretty much coming out of COVID for 5 years.
Yep, it's just more pain. And one of the reasons why I think as well that food has been largely ignored, because that's a huge, it's a huge proportion of where consumers spend their discretionary income. Well, I'm not sure how discretionary food is, but anyway, we have choices we can make at least around what we eat. So, largely keeping that one off the table, I think makes good sense. Let's not increase the inflation burden on households at a time when, like you say, we've been hit with massive increases in the family food cost bill over the past 5 years.
We don't know where this is going to go. Like there are Canadian tariffs that are supposed to go into effect the day after Labor Day. I guess there's a possibility at this point that they could work something out by then. Maybe not likely, but it's possible. All of these sort of shifts to buy Canadian and go to your local businesses instead, does that make a difference?
I think at the margins, for sure, it's going to help some of them. And the other thing is, depending on which thing it is that we've tariffed, and I'm talking now about the counter tariffs, it's going to put some pressure. Remember, we have midterm elections coming up in about roughly 2 months, a little more than 2 months. And I think the timing that the Prime Minister and his team have chosen for imposition of our counter tariffs, I think I think it was strategically done, putting it as the day after Labor Day, which is traditionally kind of when the campaigns really start. So by targeting tariffs against products that are primarily made in states that lean Republican, there's the potential to put some pressure on the president at a time when we all know he's already under a fair bit. So it could help. That definitely could help.
Is there something that could be leveraged by Canada? I mean, the timing is interesting. You make a good point there. But is there something that could be leveraged by Canada to sort of lean a little more heavily on the U.S. that we're not doing?
I think we have to acknowledge the power differential. So for us to try to act like the tough guy probably doesn't make sense. And I would probably say that we should maybe instead pull out more carrots and fewer sticks. And one that, I never had a good idea that I didn't steal from somebody else. And this one I'm stealing from the Conservative Party. But they've talked about possibly using defense procurement. And, we have to up our defense spending anyway. I think most Canadians agree with that. And in fact, the Prime Minister has committed to do that. So perhaps offering to buy more things from the United States in that category, that might be one thing that we could do. But yeah, trying to act the tough guy, I don't think that's going to help. I don't think that's going to work in our favor.
Well, and the other thing that I find very interesting is that, I mean, as you have said, it would seem to me a lot of these organizations that are advocating for the small businesses sort of acknowledge that we couldn't sit by and let this happen. There had to be some sort of counterpunch. But there's an acknowledgement at the same time that, there's the potential for this to hurt. Is there a chance this gets sorted out from where you're sitting?
Well, for sure, trade wars end, absolutely. At some point, I think things will quiet down. No question about it. Whether we're going to get back to a close to 0% tariff across the board situation like we had for a long time, probably not during the Trump regime. I think that would be, be folly to be betting on that. But yeah, eventually trade wars end. However, the thing is, the procurement relationships that are being reset, the question is about that. Will those go back? So let's say that Canadian firm that switches away from a U.S. supplier and finds a Canadian alternative, thanks to the counter tariffs, are they going to switch back to that U.S. supplier? Maybe not. So there could be, there could be lasting damage on both sides of the border.
It's so interesting. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about this today. I really appreciate your insight.
Sure, my pleasure. Thank you.
Brad Poulus is lecturer in the Entrepreneurship Department at Toronto Metropolitan University at the Ted Rogers School of Management. And that wraps up another episode of In This Economy. Past episodes can be found on the Seeker app. I'm Kris McCusker. Thanks for listening.